This is Aphorism 15 from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. This is going to be an analysis on our sense organs, sense perception, and how these perceptive events or causes relate to our mind. Nietzsche is going to oppose specifically an idealistic interpretation or an idealist interpretation of the senses, arguing that sensations, and the relationship with our sense organs are not mere appearances. They're not merely phenomena that the mind is simply observing, independent of the sensations themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and read. To study physiology with a good conscience, we must insist the sense organs are not appearances in the way idealist philosophy uses that term. As such, they certainly could not be causes. So for Nietzsche, it's really important to understand that our sense organs are causally related to our mind, our bodies, and whatever happens with us. So they're causally connected, right? And this makes sense. When you see something distinctive, it's causing something to happen in your mind, which is to say you're processing the observation of that thing. Okay? So it's not like our eyes are just simply passively taking in images. No, there's a constant process through which the seeing of images is active and causal. It's not mere phenomena. Now, I'm not sure if this is a particularly charitable interpretation of idealist philosophy, but this is what Nietzsche seems to argue for. So what does he say next? Sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative principle, if not as a heuristic principle. And this isn't really a grammatically correct sentence. He would say, we should employ, or let's employ sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative principle, if not as a heuristic principle. What does he mean? Well, trusting our senses and understanding their affective nature, their capacity to affect us, understanding our organs and the way that they relate to the mind, allows us to create a heuristic organizing principle through which we can study ourselves. Right? A heuristic principle is something that you employ through your own mind. How do you come to self-knowledge? Well, Nietzsche's going to say, I want to try a sensualist approach as opposed to an idealist approach. We're going to take seriously the sense organs. So if I were to say that Nietzsche is critiquing the idealists here, I would take a nice aside and bring up two figures, Berkeley and Kant. They're two very different types of idealists. Nietzsche doesn't say here which one he's critiquing, so I'm going to have to approach either in their own way. So, in the first paragraph, Nietzsche is rejecting this idealistic interpretation of sense phenomena. Idealists either reject the existence of the material world altogether, like Berkeley, or they argue that the relationship between the senses and the external world is always merely phenomenal, like Kant. The mind, being central to idealism in each instance, perceives sensations passively. It is the mind's peculiar ability to assent, or affirm, or deny the reality of sense phenomena that allows the idealist to argue on behalf of the mind's superiority to the bodily organs. Which is to say the mind is what we're going to rely on in terms of the interpretation of the bodily organs or the perceptions of phenomena that we see or experience through our organs. This mind's elevated capacity above the body is rooted in the father of modern philosophy, Descartes. Right? The mind is capable of doubting all of the senses, but it cannot doubt its own existence. So, it is a sort of seed of the mental superiority over the senses that is conveyed throughout the rest of idealistic philosophy, which is to say that the senses, what they sort of see or phenomenally bring into the body through perceptions, is not as real as whatever is happening cognitively. Or in the case of Berkeley, we have to reinterpret the material world mentally, so that it's not a material world, it's an idealist world. So in opposition to the idealists, Nietzsche argues that our sense organs have a causal relationship with us. Sensations or phenomena are not passively observed by a rational mind clearly and directly, but instead are constantly causing and molding us in all sorts of ways. Which is to say, the mind is not so much separate from the bodily organs, but is instead comprised of them. It is part and parcel of the bodily organs. You could even go so far as to say the mind is an organ, it's the brain, maybe, or the interplay between all the organs. But either way, what we are is not self-evident, and most importantly, whatever the mind is not going to be separate from the bodily organs and the senses that we perceive on a day-to-day basis. There's not that dualism there. So, the mind is not so much separate from the bodily organs, but instead comprised of them. We are our body, and thus we are our bodily organs. Our bodily organs are causes of sensations and phenomena, while themselves being sensations and phenomena. If this sounds paradoxical, just wait until the second paragraph. Okay. So, let's go to that second paragraph now. Nietzsche asks, and other people even say that the external world is the product of our organs. So, a philosophy that might argue this would say the organs are producing an image of the external world, or constructing an image of the external world that is constantly being molded to fit the perceptions and faculties of thought that all the organs are sort of working with, are following. But then our body as a piece of this external world itself. You see, in this original sentence where the external world is a product of the organs, we have a division between the body and the external material world. But then the body can contemplate itself as a material thing that is a part of the external world, which then makes its own material existence, its own external existence, a product of itself. The organs are perceiving or interpreting itself and then constructing a sense of self in the same way that these organs, the self, are constructing and producing an image or understanding of the world, the external world. Now, Nietzsche isn't saying that he believes this. He's following us through a very strange line of logic. But it reminds me of the way that it's kind of Hegelian, the way the mind is capable of interpreting itself, and in and through interpreting itself, it is then changing itself, and then producing a new self at every given moment, a particular aspect of the self-reflective mind. It seems paradoxical, right? We are both our mind, and the mind reflecting upon the mind, and the product of what that ultimate process produces. It's all of us. We are all of these things at the same time. Nietzsche's saying a similar thing here, but he's arguing on behalf of the body and a whole organism. Bodily organs together comprise a self instead of just a mind. And all these bodily organs, mental activities included, can reflect upon the self and then produce the self through the self. And then Nietzsche says, well, this looks to me like a thorough reduction to the absurd. It's absurd. How can something be self-caused? Given that the concept of a self-causation is something thoroughly absurd. Because he just argued that the body is causing its own existence to be. Similar to the way Hegel argues that we are causing our own existence, living for ourselves by internalizing our mental faculties, interpreting our own existence, and constantly actively constructing new senses of selfhood, or new senses of existence. But so Nietzsche then says, so does it follow that the external world is not the product of our organs? And it just really isn't clear here what he thinks. But I think what he's saying here is that my takeaway is that he believes all of this. The second half here. He runs us through this paradoxical process with all the organs are sort of causally creating their own interpretations of themselves as a holistic being. I think he believes this is true, but what we have here is sloppy logic. You know, we're preserving the sense of an ego when we say the self is creating the self, or the self is the cause of the self, when in reality, the self is not a singular thing, but is a multiplicity, and all the various aspects of the self are contributing to what the self ultimately is. So it's not really self-causation. The accusation of causa sui I don't think follows here. So I think he's saying ultimately that it is possible. He's alluding to the possibility. In the beginning, Nietzsche said, oh, we philosophers, we should embrace these wonderful what-ifs, these wonderful possibilities that philosophers before us would not consider. I think Nietzsche's here is saying, let's consider the possibility that it is such the fact that the external world is the product of our organs, that our sense of ourselves is the product of our organs, that our organs are a part and parcel of who we are. We're organic creatures, and what are organs but sort of machines? They are, they're producing things. They're functioning. So yeah, a very strange aphorism, but a fun one. And now, very similarly, I'm going to talk about 16. Because Nietzsche had critiqued a sort of passive approach to phenomena in idealist philosophy and wants us to instead to understand sense phenomena as something uh, part and parcel of the flux of self-creation. He's going to again critique the immediate certainties of the harmless self-observer. There are still harmless self-observers who believe in the existence of immediate certainties, such as I think or the I will. That was Schopenhauer's superstition. Okay, both Schopenhauer and Descartes trying to create metaphysical systems by appealing to an immediate certainty. Descartes arguing that you cannot doubt the phrase "I think, therefore I am." It was self-evident, but Nietzsche's famous for critiquing Descartes and saying, "Well, do you really know what it means to think? Do you really know what the I is to which you refer in this sentence? No, there's still missing information here. It's not as self-evident as you think." And similarly with Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer tries to construct an entire metaphysical system where he argues that instead of, according to Kant, we can't know the true nature of things in and of themselves, Schopenhauer says we can know the true nature of things in themselves and argues that that thing is the will. The will is the true essence of all things in and of themselves, this ever-striving, never-satisfied, always suffering will. And so Nietzsche's saying, well, again, his imminent critique here in Beyond Good and Evil is that he's just going to attack everyone. This chapter is called the presuppositions of philosophers, the assumptions of philosophers, something along those lines. And here's yet another one, two of them. So what does he say? Just as if knowledge had been given an object here to seize, stark naked as a thing in itself, and no falsification took place from either the side of the subject or the side of the object, which in here is sort of both. But I will say this 100 times. Immediate certainty, like absolute knowledge, and the thing in itself contains a contradiction in adjecto, which is a reduction to an absurdity, a contradiction. I'm sorry, a contradiction in terms. For once and for all, we should free ourselves from the seduction of words. Let the people believe that knowing means knowing to the very end. The philosopher has to say, when I dissect the process expressed in the proposition, I think, I get a whole set of bold claims that are difficult, perhaps impossible to establish. For instance, that I am the one who is thinking, that there must be something that is thinking in the first place, that thinking is an activity and the effect of a being who is considered the cause, that there is an I, and finally, that it has already been determined what is meant by thinking, or what is meant by the I, that I know that I'm thinking. So Nietzsche's taking Descartes' supposedly radical skepticism to sort of just a whole nother degree, but it's not skepticism. It's instead sort of an embrace of philosophical momentum. Nietzsche isn't saying, the goal here is to be absolutely certain, and we have failed in that endeavor. No. He would say that we have created a philosophical sort of sentence upon which much more creative interpretation is required. Much more work is required. And we shouldn't turn away from that or try and oversimplify this phrase in order to construct something simple and self-evident. On the contrary, we should see the phrase as inviting us to further philosophical discourse so that we can understand more about what it means to think, what it means to be a self. So Descartes' cogito says a heck of a lot more about what we don't know than what we do know. What it's saying we do know is just a tiny little thing. And Nietzsche doesn't think it's very important. But what it's saying, what it's bringing to the table is a whole bunch of uncertainties. What does it mean to think? What is a self? How can a subjective self be thinking? What is that? What is that? So, like all good philosophy, more questions are invited to the table. Okay. Because if I had not already made up my mind what thinking is, how could I tell whether what had just happened was not perhaps willing, or feeling, or maybe even dreaming? Enough! This I think presupposes that I compare my present state with other states that I have seen in myself. right? So feelings, willings, in order to determine what it is, and because of this retrospective comparison with other types of knowing, this present state has absolutely no immediate certainty for me. It has relative certainty connected to all of these assumptions that we make regarding other aspects of ourselves, right? I'm thinking, not feeling. I'm thinking, not dreaming. I'm not willing. This is thinking, rational thought. I know what that is, but I only know what that is in context to other things. It's not immediately certain that I'm thinking. In order to convince me that this thing that I'm doing right now is thinking, you have to have an argument. And in order to construct that argument, you're going to have to compare this thought process or this thinking activity to other activities in order to differentiate or explicate what it means to think. So thinking cannot just exist on its own as an immediate self-certainty because it's a distinctive mode of a process compared to other potential processes. It's a type of doing. It's an activity amongst many other activities. In place of that immediate certainty, which may in this case win the faith of the people, the philosopher gets handed a whole assortment of metaphysical questions, genuinely probing intellectual questions of conscience, such as where do I get the concept of thinking from? Why do I believe in causes and effects? What gives me the right to speak about an I, and for that matter, about an I as cause, and finally, about an I as the cause of thoughts specifically? Whoever dares to answer these metaphysical questions right away with an appeal to a sort of intuitive knowledge, like the person who says, I think and know that at least this is true, real, or certain, he'll find a philosopher today ready with a smile and 2 question marks. My dear sir, the philosopher will perhaps give him to understand. It is improbable that you are not mistaken. But why insist on the truth? It's a good point. Why insist on the truth? What is the goal of philosophy? Is it to come at some final end where we have our dear certainty that is infallible and we will never move from this place? Or is philosophy instead an enterprise that is constantly molding and shifting and branching off into different places? The moment I stake my claim absolutely here and say, I insist this is 100% true, I'm immobilizing myself. I'm stunting the inquiry. When Descartes says, I have done radical skepticism and I've reached the end, I found the immediate certainty, I then can go back. Right? He no longer is motivated to ask questions like, what does it mean to think? What does it mean to be a self? Because he doesn't want to go that far. He stops short, insists on his truth, and then goes back home to his previous presumptions. And this is not the type of philosophy that Nietzsche is asking us or suggesting that we try. Okay, so that's 15 and 16. Nietzsche continues his radical critique of all philosophical problems so far. And he's doing this to shake up the ground, to create new philosophy, to keep the endeavor going. Try and think of different ways that we can philosophize moving forward. Okay.